ROV, or remote operated vehicle, from the vessel Horizon Arctic discovered the tail cone of the Titan submersible approximately 1,600 feet from the bow of the Titanic on the seafloor. The ROV subsequently found additional debris. In consultation with experts from within the Unified Command, the debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. Upon this determination, we immediately notified the families.
This is a Wyatt Sharp Show special report. Hello there, good evening. Thank you so much for being with us amidst these very tragic circumstances. As we are coming on the air tonight with breaking news, and we continue to get some new developments as it relates to this story. First, though, the U.S. Coast Guard has announced that debris found 1,600 feet away from the Titanic wreckage is, quote, consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber of the Titan. OceanGate has released a statement which reads, in part, "We now believe that our CEO, Stockton Rush Shahzada DeWood, and his son, Suleiman DeWood, Hamish Harding, and Paul Henry Nargeolet have sadly been lost. These men were true explorers who shared a distinct spirit of adventure and a deep passion for exploring and protecting the world's oceans. Our hearts are with these 5 souls and every member of their families during this tragic time. We grieve the loss of life and joy they brought to everyone they knew. This is an extremely sad time for our dedicated employees who are exhausted and grieving deeply over this loss. The entire OceanGate family is deeply grateful for the countless men and women from multiple organizations of the international community who expedited wide-ranging resources and have worked so very hard on this mission. We appreciate their commitment to finding these 5 explorers and their days and nights of tireless work in support of our crew and their families." And now I do want to go straight to some reaction as it relates to this situation. And we are going to start tonight with William Tody, a now retired captain of the U.S. Naval Institute, who is joining me now. William Tody is with me now. Captain, thank you for making the time.
Sure, Wyatt, glad to be here. I wish it were under better circumstances.
Absolutely, of course. So perhaps let's just start out with the tragic situation as to how this has ended up. Obviously not the way that anyone was wanting this to end up. Certainly, though, the entire world was really watching this situation, wondering what was going to come next. At one point, it seemed as if there might have been a little bit of hope with noises that some people had heard coming from this submersible. I guess just I wonder, when you heard of those reports that there were some noises, did that give you any hope? And I guess what does that say about potentially future investigations, you know, if things like this could happen again?
First of all, with respect to the noises, no, it didn't give me any hope at all. But you need to understand my background. I'm a U.S. Navy submariner. I've spent years of my life underwater. So I've listened to the ocean for many years, and I know that the ocean is a very loud place. And when you hear things like random banging, that could come from a ship that's 100 miles away. It could come from natural phenomenon like like geologic situations and biologic situations. So you hear things like this all the time in the ocean. If it's somebody who wants to be rescued, generally what you hear is a very deliberate signaling, an SOS. Everybody should know how to do that. You hear something like that. You don't hear just random clanging. When you add that to the fact that this communications was lost abruptly an hour and a half into a 2.5 hour descent, as it was making its way to the bottom of the ocean to the Titanic, it was already likely that submersible had experienced a traumatic event on Sunday, which meant that this clanging probably had nothing to do with the Titan.
And when you look at what investigators, what the search crews were looking for, at one point, the search field was about the state of Connecticut multiplied by 2, which obviously makes things way more complicated. When you heard, though, the news from OceanGate that they said, quote, that they had been sadly lost, the 5 passengers that were on board, what does it say that some of these people, were willing to go on this submersible without knowing that it could potentially come back? I mean, they're going to the site of something that previously had took place that also was equally as devastating.
Yeah. Remember that people climb Mount Everest all the time, and a lot of people die doing that. And yet no government regulation has emerged, no government entity has come forward and said, you can't climb Mount Everest anymore. These explorers look at this, journey to the Titanic, the same way they look at climbing Mount Everest. They say, well, we understand the risk. We're explorers, we're willing to take the risk. There's a difference, though. When somebody climbs Mount Everest, they can independently determine their own readiness to make that trek up that mountain. They can evaluate that for themselves. In the case of the Titan and this situation, the people that paid to take this trip cannot evaluate the readiness of that submersible themselves. They have to take the word of the designers and builders. And this was a submersible that was designed and built by a company that had no independent oversight. So there was nobody looking over their shoulder. There's nobody verifying that the testing that they had done was adequate. And so these people literally, as we now know, put their lives in the hands of people that they probably didn't know very well, and trusted engineering that they probably didn't understand, and that nobody else had independently evaluated. So while they may say, look, this is like going up Mount Everest, I reject that, because these folks had no way to know whether what they were doing was safe.
And I want to pick up on something that you mentioned there. From a regulation standpoint, from a preparation standpoint, going on something in the future that could be described as the equivalent of this particular mission, what can be done to strengthen preparation efforts, and furthermore, perhaps from either a legislative standpoint or what have you, to perhaps increase regulations rather, to ensure that this can be a safer process?
Those are exactly the right questions to ask, Wyatt. So the first thing you do is you ask for outside independent oversight and scrutiny of your work. If I'm doing calculations that my life depends on the adequacy of those calculations, I'm going to want somebody to check my math. It just goes to it just makes sense. The second thing you do is you don't treat this submersible as an independent, isolated unit. You have to treat it like a system. And the system has to include redundant, casualty processes and other equipment that you need in case a bad thing happens. You have to have thought through different potential outcomes, and you have to have staged equipment so that if something bad does happen, it's ready to go. It's not a situation where people are saying, oh no, we can't talk to them anymore. What do we do now? Which is kind of what seems to have happened here. If you've got systems and processes in place, equipment staged, you've rehearsed it, you've trained on it, and you've got enough redundancy, then you're going to reduce the probability that something like this catastrophic happens.
Okay, we are going to leave it there tonight. That is Captain William Tody. Thanks so much for making the time. I do appreciate it.
Sure thing, Wyatt. Take care.
All right, that was Captain William Tody joining us tonight to talk a little bit about how we can prevent situations like this tragic one from happening once again in the future. Certainly and undoubtedly conversations that will be had now and will be talked about now for the coming weeks, coming months, even coming years, as this really is a tragic situation. We are going to take a quick break right now, and we will be back in just a few moments. Stay with us.
Morning, an ROV or remote operated vehicle from the vessel Horizon Arctic discovered the tail cone of the Titan submersible approximately 1,600 feet from the bow of the Titanic on the seafloor. The ROV subsequently found additional debris. In consultation with experts from within the Unified Command, the debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. Upon this determination, we immediately notified the families.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us once again amidst these tragic circumstances that, again, a large portion of the world is currently following. For more now, I do want to turn to Tom Maddox. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Underwater Forensic. He is joining us tonight to talk a little bit about what we know thus far, what these circumstances actually mean, and whether or not perhaps those noises that we were hearing coming from the ocean, from the body of water, actually really revealed any true sense of hope. Joining me now is Tom Maddox. He is the CEO of Underwater Forensic Investigators. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So obviously the eyes of the practically entirety of the world were on this situation with this missing submersible. It is now obviously, we have 5 of the people who were on board. OceanGate says that they have, quote, sadly been lost. How did we get to this point?
Well, exploration is an important part of the world, and Titanic has always been a Mount Everest of the underwater world. So I was part of the expedition in 2005, the international expedition in the Russian Mir subs. After our expedition, there was a 10-year period of no manned exploration to Titanic. OceanGate came along and decided they wanted to try something new with a new design of their submersible and to take paying passengers along. They got out there. They've done a number of dives. They went, of course, this week and met a catastrophe. And our hearts and condolences go out to all the families and friends that are associated with that program.
And is it likely at this point in time, given still the fact that there are a lot of unknowns in relation to the situation, that the victims' families will be able to, have them buried, or is it not likely at this point in time, given the nature of the situation?
Well, that's a great question. They found, obviously, we know at this point, they found debris that they've identified as coming from the submersible. The problem is that at 2.5 miles down, and the impact of the implosion, that there are probably debris spread quite a distance over the ocean bottom. So now it becomes a question of time and money, because the operation to stay out there on site is extremely expensive. And we hate to put a dollar sign on human life, but they will look for a while and see if they can find the pressure hull, and hopefully the remains of the explorers are still within that capsule. But it's highly likely that the implosion scattered them and the submersible over a long distance. So we may never retrieve them.
And I suppose when we talk about the fact that, again, a lot of the world has been looking at what's happening with this situation, you had for a short period of time people having a sense of hope, given that they were hearing some sort of noises coming. Did that give you any sort of hope? And I guess what does that particularly say about kind of the investigative process through trying to locate where this submersible actually was?
Well, banging on the hull of a submersible has been a signal that's been, used by submariners for many, many years. So going into this, we were hoping that we would be able to pick that up. It was the best information that we got since the beginning of the mission. When we found out that they went silent and didn't know anything about what happened, when we got the first reports that there was some banging, and particularly they initially reported, if you remember, that they heard it at 30-minute intervals. That would indicate that it was human created, not just biological sound or artificial sound coming underwater, that a timed interval, and they use threes like in Morse code, then that would indicate that there was some kind of a signal coming from. So that was our greatest hope. And then it became an analysis of, okay, if they're there, where are they, and how long will it take to get to them? So unfortunately, it didn't work out, but that was, as you mentioned, probably the most hopeful time during the recovery.
And just before we conclude here, I mean, does this really, from your perspective, increase the need for perhaps more preparation before going out on a mission of this nature, given, the fact that they only, of course, had a certain level of oxygen available to them, and really the countdown was on for a lot of people trying to take note of how much oxygen was actually left for these 5 passengers on board?
Well, even in 2023, very little is known or done about deep ocean exploration, particularly that deep. Once we get past the couple 1,000-foot mark, that it's no man's land. So what a lot of us would like to see is more money come in, possibly from international sources and governments, for more deep water exploration. That would mean that we could develop better systems, safer systems, and better procedures and protocol to do these type of dives. Unfortunately, in order to get there now to those kind of depths, most of it is privately funded, and money is hard to come by. So with an influx of funds and interest by the world community, by international community, maybe we can create better systems and safer systems and do better exploration.
All right, that was Tom Maddox of Underwater Forensic Investigations. We are going to take one last break. When we come back tonight, we will continue to dive into what we know about this situation and about what this could actually mean, and what the oxygen countdown in that submersible actually meant. Were these people actually potentially going to be able to survive this situation with how much oxygen it would have taken to come from where they were in the ocean, in the body of water, back to the surface of the water and back to land? We'll be right back. Stay with us.
an ROV or remote operated vehicle from the vessel Horizon Arctic discovered the tail cone of the Titan submersible approximately 1,600 feet from the bow of the Titanic on the seafloor. The ROV subsequently found additional debris. In consultation with experts from within the Unified Command, the debris is consistent with the catastrophic loss of the pressure chamber. Upon this determination, we immediately notified the families.
All right, thanks so much for being with us, as we've been saying all throughout the program. Truly a sad day, a historic time, I guess you could call it. I mean, it's not very often that these submersibles go missing, and certainly not very often that you have the entirety of the world grieving and feeling almost a sense of loss collectively as it relates to this situation. We appreciate you staying with us for this special report tonight. It really is a truly sad time. Rachel Lands is an assistant consulting professor at Duke University. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry it's under these circumstances.
Most definitely. Let's just start out with how we got to this point. I mean, you mentioned the circumstances. Certainly, these are circumstances that no one wants to be under. But what does this say, perhaps, that we are in this situation, that OceanGate announced that the 5 passengers that were in the submersible have since now been lost? What does it say about the need for perhaps more preparation, perhaps more regulations before going out on such a mission of this nature?
I think that's an excellent point, and that's, in my opinion, the major take home of this entire incident. When the USS Thresher sank in 1963, the US Navy implemented a program called SubSafe, and since then, they've had a remarkably positive track record in terms of submarine safety. However, unfortunately, a lot of these private industries have not necessarily respected the lessons that were learned because of so many sinkings and lives lost in the past. And what ends up happening is an incident like the one we experienced this week. I want to be clear that I do think every human being deserves the opportunity for rescue, and I do think every human being deserves the opportunity to feel safe when they're signing up for these programs. So I think what this really speaks to is the need for regulation and oversight to make sure that some of these tech firms are not willfully ignoring the lessons of the past.
And do you think perhaps that now there will be any sort of more in-depth further conversation before going out on such a mission? I mean, given the fact that as a result of what's happened, as a result of these 5 lives now being lost, essentially the entirety of the world is talking about this situation, not just today, but over the course of the past couple of days as well.
I don't really know. As a biomedical engineer and someone who specializes in undersea survival and submersibles, I'm not really as tuned into the social aspects of how that regulation occurs, but I am hopeful that this incident can draw attention to those types of needs, because in my opinion, they're very long overdue, and I would be happy to be part of that conversation.
So perhaps then let's pick up on that. I mean, there was oftentimes the countdown that people would see as to how much oxygen was left, how much more time these 5 people that were on board could have possibly survived. I mean, how much hope did you actually have, last night and in the days leading up to today that something would actually be able to occur and that these people could actually be brought to land?
I hate to sound pessimistic, but upon hearing from the incident, I immediately did not have a lot of hope. There were a couple factors in play here. First, upon learning about the submarine design and some of the materials chosen, they were not what I would consider robust design choices. On top of that, after looking at publicly available pictures, and I want to be clear, I don't have any direct inside information. I'm just going on what's publicly available. But I wasn't able to find anything on the submarine itself that looked like a breathing system that had the capacity for the 96 hours that OceanGate was claiming. I crunched the numbers for that, and even if all 5 people were sitting at rest, they would have still needed about 14,500 liters of oxygen, which is roughly the amount that would fit in 6.5 regular-sized scuba tanks. And then they would have needed a carbon dioxide scrubber with a capacity of at least half of a normal bathtub. And on top of that, with that scrubbing type material, you need to very carefully insulate it. The insulation becomes really bulky because that material works less well in the cold. So looking at the pictures, there didn't seem to be anything on the submarine that was even capable of reaching those number of hours advertised. So I was already a little bit suspicious about some of the claims and a little bit concerned that they might be overstating the survival capacity.
So perhaps then let's again pick up on that piece. I mean, a lot of people were talking about how there were some noises that people were hearing that I guess gave some people some sort of hope that potentially something could occur. And again, that these 5 passengers could be brought back to land. I was just talking to someone who said that, you know, obviously the size of the search field was about 2 times the size of the state of Connecticut, which obviously I'm sure makes things even more complicated. Just from what you know, I mean, how likely was it at any given point that they could have been brought back to land, and at what point did you yourself perhaps start to lose a sense of hope?
I think given what we know now about the fact that it's a debris field, there was never really any hope to begin with. It seems pretty clear that this was an implosion event. Those occur extremely quickly. So they don't necessarily happen in the sense of the submarine resting on the bottom and then days later imploding. They typically happen as a sudden crumpling event on descent. Now, the sounds of hearing the rhythmic, perhaps tapping or whatever sounds were interpreted, I think that's a little bit difficult to speak to without knowing exactly what was going on. But it's really important to remember that the ocean is a very noisy place. Sound travels for miles underwater, and that also makes it really complicated to figure out exactly where it's coming from. And so while that was an admirable thing to follow up on, and the searchers who found the remains of the sub did a spectacular job with an almost impossible task, it's very difficult to say that anything further could have been done.
Okay, we'll leave it there tonight. That's Rachel Lance, Assistant Consulting Professor at Duke University. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.